Hi, and welcome to the screencast on the autonomic nervous system. We'll probably get through the whole autonomic nervous system in one shot. So it might be a little long, but it's also going to be just one screencast for the whole chapter. So it shouldn't be too bad. Let's move right ahead. The autonomic nervous system controls everything that you don't think about, so subconscious control. And yes, I did just move this picture over versus what you have. So if you have the latest version, if you're using the links, you might have the up-to-date file. At any rate, mostly you want to think of it as things that are being not under your conscious control. And those things that are not under your conscious control include tissues such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. This includes reproductive glands, smooth muscle and blood vessels, and other smooth muscle, blood vessel, and glands that are part of your reproductive system. So we don't talk much about reproduction, but it is largely under the control of the autonomic nervous system. And while I'm thinking about it, it's actually kind of interesting because both your sympathetic and your parasympathetic branch have a role to play. The parasympathetic being rest and digest. How should I put it? Well, no, I'm just going to start the whole thing over again. Hi, welcome to the autonomic nervous system. We should be able to get through this whole thing in one screencast. This is an abbreviated version. I don't know how many slides are in the chat. Oh my God, there's only 19 slides in the chapter. This is easy. All right, so first thing you want to know is actually really the second thing on the list here, right? Start by just thinking about how does the autonomic nervous system work in your head, right? And it's all the stuff that you are not consciously controlling. And then you can kind of work back to what sorts of tissues are not under conscious control. The smooth muscle means digestive system and blood vessels. Cardiac muscle is obviously heart. And then the glands are things like sweat glands and salivary glands and reproductive glands. We don't talk much about your reproductive function vis-a-vis the autonomic nervous system, but right, arousal, climax, all of that, you're not necessarily in conscious control over it, so that's going to be autonomic nervous system. And then that's really all we'll say about the role of the autonomic nervous system in sexual function. So then getting into the actual autonomic nervous system itself, before we get into the sympathetic division versus the parasympathetic division, both divisions have the same basic two-cell structure to get from the central nervous system to the target organ. So whether you are talking about the let me get a thicker line here, sorry. Whether you're talking about the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division, somewhere in your central nervous system, either brainstem or spinal cord, is going to be what we call preganglionic neuron, and we'll get into the difference of pre versus postganglionic neuron. But there's going to be a neuron whose cell body resides somewhere in your central nervous system. It is then going to send out a fiber to a ganglion, and then there will be a second neuron, thicker line, there's our second neuron there, that's going to run from the ganglion to the target organ. So you have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, this two-neuron chain that gets you from the central nervous system to your target organ. And you will remember that a ganglion, we said, was a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So if you look at a ganglion, you'd have a bunch of preganglionic axons coming into the ganglion, but then the ganglion itself would contain all of the cell bodies of what are called postganglionic fibers. So these are all then going to go off from the ganglion and hit some target tissue and then dump neurotransmitter onto the target tissue. So all of these ganglia are outside of the central nervous system, just like your dorsal root ganglia are collections of sensory neuron cell bodies that are just outside of the spinal cord, so they're peripheral nervous system collections of neuron cell bodies. All right, so then let me just go back here, do a Control-M, and delete some stuff. So for each one, whoops, I just want a blank slide that I can write on, but I'd select that and delete the whole thing. There we go. We're not going to worry about the title. So you want, for each branch, know the names, because there's more than one name for each branch. The basic function. And then it is going to be, let's see, origin of preganglionic fibers, location of ganglia. Where the ganglia are located are going to change how long the preganglionic versus the postganglionic fibers are. You'll see this. So we will say relative length of fibers. So this is preganglionic relative to postganglionic, or vice versa. Let's see, neurotransmitters used. And is there anything else? Origin, the location. There might be other things, but I'm thinking this is basically what you want to know for each thing. The names that each branch goes by, basic functions of each branch, and then these descriptions of how each branch works. So first up is parasympathetic, which you want to know is also sometimes called craniosacral, or the rest and digest system. Craniosacral because it is cranial nerves and sacral nerves that contain the preganglionic nerve fibers. And this is more active when you are relaxed, so it's lowering your heart rate, your respiratory rate. It is slowing down the peristalsis, inhibiting contractions of the smooth muscle in your reproductive system. And it also affects vision, and this has to do with the day-to-day is something close or is it far away part of vision, and then also are you relaxed or are you anxious parts of vision. So like regardless of what your anxiety state is, if something is close up, it is easier to read things if your pupils are constricted. And your lens is thicker, making it easier to focus. So that is a job of the parasympathetic nervous system. What do we want to know about the structure of the parasympathetic nervous system? So we already went over, I should say, hold on. Well, here we are. Yeah, we'll get to it. We will talk about the origin of the preganglionic fibers. Oh, it's there. Totally not doing too good today. So here we are, right? Brainstem and sacral region of the spinal cord. That's what sacral cord means. In the next slide, we'll go over which individual cranial nerves are used, but for now, no, it's called craniosacral because it's cranial nerves and spinal nerves that come from the sacral region of the spinal cord or your brain stem. The ganglia in this system are located within the target organ itself. So this is supposed to be the heart. Somewhere in the heart is a ganglion. So preganglionic fibers from this nerve, the vagus nerve, are going to go from the brain stem all the way to the heart. And then if we just draw a goofy looking heart here, there would be maybe right here a ganglion, and then from that would come a bunch of postganglionic fibers. So those blue things that I just drew right there are the postganglionic fibers. If I tried to draw them over there, it would be really hard because the heart is so small, and I'll use red. So then if you look at the length of those red fibers over here, right, versus the length of this fiber going from the spinal cord, brainstem, it would be medulla oblongata, all the way down to the heart, that is going to be longer than going from one part of the heart to the other part of the heart. So because of where the intramural ganglia are located, the preganglionic fibers tend to be long. They are going to release acetylcholine onto the short postganglionic fibers, which are also going to release acetylcholine. And I never thought about this particular example before, but if the preganglionic fibers here are always going to cause the release of acetylcholine, but your parasympathetic, which would be excitatory, right? But your parasympathetic nervous system doesn't always cause excitation. Just right here, looking at the function of the preganglionic fibers versus the postganglionic fibers, we're going to see acetylcholine always stimulating postganglionic fibers. But the acetylcholine that gets released from the postganglionic fibers is not always going to be perceived as stimulatory by the target tissue. So we're going to have opportunities for different receptors in different places. I got a little bit ahead of myself there, but I just started thinking about those postganglionic fibers. All right, then a little bit of detail. You do want to know that it is cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 that are included as part of your parasympathetic nervous system. It would be nice to know, I don't know if I ask on the exam, matching up each one with its target organs. Really the most important one to know is vagus, because if you look at the vagus nerve, it's heart, it's lungs. It is your upper GI tract, so esophagus, stomach, and large parts of your small and large intestine. So that one nerve goes to a lot of different places, carries a lot of different nerve fibers, and is going to control a lot of different things. And then just know that it's 2 sacral spinal nerves. I don't care if you know their numbers because it's really not important. And then just know that that's for the stuff that's anatomically lower down. So the bottom of your GI tract, colon, lower parts of your small intestine, and then bladder, ureters, and reproductive organs. Then the sympathetic division, aka thoracolumbar, that's based on the origin of the preganglionic nerve fibers, or the fight or flight system. And I don't really like these images, so if you look at this image right here, whoops, I just went to circle on the screen instead of on my pad. That is supposed to be your sympathetic nervous system, and this is supposed to be your parasympathetic nervous system. I guess if you toggle between the two quickly, the differences come to light, but they're just so similar. So here, if you look, right, where am I? cranial nerves, sacral nerves, and if you bink real quick, it's all thoracic and lumbar nerves is what we're getting at. Can I delete that? Look at that. All right, so thoracolumbar, aka sympathetic, aka fight or flight system. So this is going to be activated in times of physical activity, either in preparation for or during physical activity. Blood will be sent to your skeletal muscles and heart. It will not then be sent to your visceral muscles. So you're going to have vasodilation to skeletal muscles, or vasodilation of blood vessels going to skeletal muscles, vasoconstriction of blood vessels going to visceral organs like stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. It causes your bronchioles to dilate, so you get better ventilation of your lungs. Your liver releases glucose, which is one of your body's favorite energy converting molecules, or molecules it uses to convert into ATP. Your heart rate's going to go up, and then your adrenal gland is going to dump adrenaline into the bloodstream, which just boosts your metabolism and extra stimulates everything. So then some of the structural stuff, right? Sympathetic, you do want to know, don't worry about the numbers, but that it is the thoracic and lumbar region of your spinal cord that contains the cell bodies of your sympathetic nervous system. So when we were looking at the spinal cord last week, and we said that lateral horn of the gray matter contains autonomic motor neurons, it's really sympathetic motor neurons, unless you're talking about the very bottom of the spinal cord. So thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord is where your preganglionic neuron cell bodies are located. In this case now, the preganglionic nerve fibers are short. They also release acetylcholine. And instead of projecting to intramural ganglia, it is either going to be the sympathetic chain of ganglia or collateral ganglia. And what they've drawn, let me get another color, light blue, like right here and here, and it's really all the way down. It's just really hard to see. If I blow that up, there we go. This is the sympathetic chain of ganglion. So here's a cell body, there's a cell body, there's a cell body. And then the spinal cord would be here. So you've got, I drew the wrong color. Right. This would be preganglionic neuron. And I got a really thick ink. Postganglionic neuron. So you're just going from the spinal cord to the sympathetic chain, which is just anterior to your vertebral column. We did not cover that when we did the spinal cord, but the sympathetic chain is right in front of the vertebral column, so just right in front of the spinal cord. So those are relatively small fibers. And then if I make this small again, these ganglia here that I don't think you need to know the names of, whoops, not quite small enough. There, now we fit. The celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, and the otic ganglia. Oh no, sorry, sympathetic chain up here. These three, celiac, superior, and inferior mesenteric, are midline structures. So they actually sit on the ventral surface of the abdominal aorta, which is a big blood vessel that runs down just anterior to your vertebral column. So this makes it look like you've got a pretty far distance to go from here to there. But in actuality, that ganglion is probably right here somewhere. But it's just got to go a little bit forward, a couple inches, and then go from the abdominal aorta, this midline structure, out to whatever target organ it is. So even though some of the fibers that they've drawn over here, trying to get rid of all that, these fibers here do look long, they are relatively short when compared to the postganglionic nerve fibers. So short preganglionic nerve fibers that project to the sympathetic chain or collateral ganglia, which are both midline structures, and then relatively longer postganglionic fibers, which project from the ganglia, either sympathetic chain or the collateral ganglia, to the target organs where they release norepinephrine. So when you're thinking about how do you remember which neuron releases which neurotransmitter, just know that all of your neurons in the sympathetic nervous system release acetylcholine except for your postganglionic sympathetic neurons, right? And it shouldn't be too hard to remember that your fight or flight system releases epinephrine or adrenaline because adrenaline is associated with fight or flight. And it would make sense that it's the postganglionic fibers that are releasing the adrenaline because those are the fibers that are stimulating your body and the glands and tissues. So it's all acetylcholine in parasympathetic, and then with sympathetic, it's acetylcholine from preganglionic, norepinephrine from postganglionic. Then we do want to bear in mind that there are some targets that the sympathetic nervous system hits that your parasympathetic does not. So your sympathetic nervous system can stimulate your sweat glands, which means you can turn them on, but they don't have an off switch. So they are either stimulated or left alone. Blood vessels. So it is only the sympathetic nervous system that can control blood flow. It's not, parasympathetic doesn't send blood to the digestive system. Blood is allowed to go to the digestive system when the sympathetic system is not in use. And then the adrenal gland as well is only under the control of the sympathetic branch. Which makes sense because there's no role for that in the parasympathetic nervous system. And that also just means there's no way to turn it off. It sits off and then can be turned on, and when it's no longer being exposed to neurotransmitter, it just shuts itself off again. All right, then, oh, I forgot. We have to talk about the special case of the adrenal medulla, which, using the pictures we have, is not easy to do. Where did it go? Yeah, they don't even do it justice. Sorry, they don't even draw it accurately is what I'm trying to say. So if I zoom in on this and make it look big, where's your adrenal gland? They've got a dotted line here going to the adrenal gland. So it looks like there's a preganglionic fiber and then a postganglionic fiber that leads to the adrenal gland. That is not the case. When it comes to your adrenal gland, and I don't know what level from the spinal cord it comes off, let's just say here, there will be a preganglionic neuron that goes right through one of those darn ganglia and straight to the adrenal medulla. Now the adrenal gland itself, also I don't have a good picture of this. Let me get a slightly smaller stylus and let's go blue. So let's say this is your adrenal gland. It's kind of triangular looking. It's got two layers to it. The outer layer is what is called the cortex. So just like the outside of your brain is the cortex, and then the inner layer is what is called the medulla. It is the medulla that receives sympathetic innervation. So it is part of your sympathetic nervous system. The outer part here in blue is traditional endocrine tissue. So it's actually a really interesting organ in that it contains nervous tissue and glandular tissue, which embryologically speaking come from two different cell populations. So it's kind of neat to have that arrangement there. And what the cells in your adrenal medulla are, sort of embryologically speaking, they are postganglionic nerve fibers that have never generated axons or never grown axons. So all of these other places, the cells that reside here, here, and here, are all derived from the same population of cells. They're all actually derived from neural crest cells. And they start here, and then they grow fibers, and they go out to a target organ. The adrenal medulla is derived from the same cells that make up all of these postganglionic nerve fibers, only they've never generated axons. So they are, embryologically speaking, neural tissue. They have all of the biochemical markers of nervous tissue, in that they release neurotransmitter the same way a neuron would release neurotransmitter. So when acetylcholine hits those cells in the adrenal medulla, these guys, gals right there, they depolarize, calcium rushes in, what are those things called? Synaptic vesicles merge with the membrane, and epinephrine and norepinephrine are released the same way that acetylcholine was released from the preganglionic nerve fibers. So it's just a really interesting story. I think I've talked about neural crest cells before. They are one of the reasons why I stuck with science, because I just find some of these stories to be too cool. Moving right along, because you probably don't think neural crest cells are cool, but I do want you to know that the adrenal medulla gets direct innervation from preganglionic fibers and then just dumps epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream because it is composed of postganglionic fibers. Only instead of going to a target organ, their target organ is the bloodstream, and they just dump neurotransmitter right into the blood vessels around them. Totally cool. Let's see, moving right along, 27 minutes, we are in good shape. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Most organs have dual innervation. Just know that. Don't worry about the rest of the stuff because it's all redundant. And then I changed something, with the exception of these things that we have already talked about, right? Your adrenal medulla, your sweat glands, and your blood vessels are only under the control of your sympathetic nervous system. So you want to remember then that your parasympathetic nervous system cannot shut off your sweat glands, and your parasympathetic nervous system doesn't control blood flow. Sweat and blood flow are completely under the control of your sympathetic nervous system. And the other thing to remember, it's not so important to remember that your parasympathetic nervous system can't shut off your adrenal gland, but it is worth remembering that your adrenal gland is going to dump epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. They will circulate for some time. I don't know what the half-life is of those neurotransmitters in the bloodstream, but this is why it takes a really long time to come down if you've been sympathetically stimulated, right? You come home from school, work, wherever you are, maybe your big brother is waiting in the bushes outside the house, because this is something that big brothers like to do to little brothers, right? They jump out of the bushes and scream. Almost immediately you know it's your big brother. But your heart rate is elevated for quite a few minutes afterwards, and your hands might be a little shaky or something because that adrenaline is still coursing through your system. So you can activate your sympathetic nervous system very quickly. It takes a while for it to wear off. Generally speaking, it's just more powerful than your parasympathetic nervous system, which would make sense because you don't necessarily need to relax in a hurry. And that's what your parasympathetic nervous system does. Then just some other little things to note. You want to know what sympathetic tone and parasympathetic tone are. As I alluded to in the joints chapter when we were talking about muscle tone, tone means constant low-level neural stimulation. So sympathetic tone means constant low-level sympathetic stimulation of blood vessels, which is why it's sometimes called vasomotor tone, right? It is the motor neurons going to your vasculature that is always constantly being stimulated by your sympathetic nervous system, which keeps all of your blood vessels, your arteries at least, somewhat constricted. And you can control, your body can control vasodilation versus vasoconstriction in part to help control the total volume in your vasculature, which is going to affect blood pressure. And when we get into anatomy and physiology too, you are going to see that blood pressure is one of those homeostatic variables that sits in the middle of many different homeostatic regulatory mechanisms because it is really important. So because it's important and it affects lots of things and lots of things affect it, explaining how blood pressure is regulated is very complicated because there's so much that goes into regulating it, all the different variables that, well, it doesn't matter. There's just a lot. And it's fun, and you have that to look forward to in anatomy and physiology, too. Shut up, Eric, and keep teaching. Next, parasympathetic tone. This is, again, constant low-level activity of your parasympathetic nervous system. In this case, it's not stimulating the heart. It's slowing the heart rate down. We are going to see that, not to get ahead of myself, in anatomy and physiology too. If you look at the sinoatrial node, which is the pacemaker of the heart, the natural rhythm of the sinoatrial node, I want to say is between 80 to 100. I might be wrong. But it is higher than most people's resting heart rate, because the sinoatrial node is slowed down by the parasympathetic nervous system when the parasympathetic nervous system is being activated. And then it also, parasympathetic tone just keeps your digestive system literally churning along, right? Muscle contractions, moving food along, and also glandular secretions. Then we do want to know, this is just some terminology, and we're not going to get into the weeds. You're already familiar with acetylcholine and epinephrine or norepinephrine. You want to add to your list of things you know this term right here, cholinergic receptors. So in addition to just saying acetylcholine receptors, sometimes we will say cholinergic receptors, and instead of saying adrenal receptors, adrenaline receptors, we will say adrenergic receptors. Then additionally, you want to know that there are subtypes of both receptors. This should not come as a shock, right? You have nicotinic acetylcholine receptors and muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. Doesn't really matter where their names come from, but that's listed there. There are also subtypes of nicotinic and muscarinic receptors, but we're not going to worry about it. We want to know those terms, and we want to remember that anytime we see more than one receptor, we should be thinking more than one possible effect in different tissues. So we're going to be seeing acetylcholine being able to stimulate one muscle and inhibit another muscle because there's going to be different neurotransmitter receptors in those muscles. Same thing with your adrenergic receptors. You have alpha adrenergic receptors, do not worry about the subtypes, and beta adrenergic receptors, also don't worry about the subtypes. So again, know that adrenergic means adrenaline receptors, and the alpha and beta are both adrenergic receptors, and remember, different receptors leads to different responses to the same neurotransmitter in different tissues. then we are just going to say that the hypothalamus is the generally in control of your autonomic nervous system. I used to have things, what's the word I'm looking for, divided up a little bit differently, but we're going to say that the hypothalamus is in control. It is obviously affected by your cerebrum, right? You can have memories of a traumatic event. Those memories that are taking place in your cerebral cortex are going to affect maybe your heart rate or your breathing or your blood pressure. So other parts of your body and physiology affect your hypothalamus, and then your hypothalamus integrates it all and decides what your autonomic response to any given situation should be. And we're not going to worry about all the individual things because it's too many things to remember. Then we talk about referred pain here, even though it's sensory and we don't lump sensory pathways into the autonomic nervous system, because your autonomic nervous system is involved in the regulation of your internal organs, and internal organs have referred pain. We bring up referred pain when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system because it controls your internal organs. So it's not really part of the autonomic nervous system, but gets associated with it. So what referred pain means is how sometimes internal organs or sensations caused by events in internal organs are felt superficially and sometimes not necessarily near the internal organ. Like some of these make sense. Your appendix is over here, and if you get a swollen, infected appendix, the pain is kind of where the appendix is. It radiates out to a region quite bigger than the appendix. But what's that? Yeah, the liver, they show small, but if anybody ever watches boxing, kickboxing, or mixed martial arts, if you get popped in the liver, your whole body shuts down. Like people drop like they got knocked out. It's a little, disturbing and both very interesting to see. So you can just look at this. Other examples where clearly pain is referring to a region distant in the body. Your pain in your ureters, like a urinary tract infection, can be felt in your thighs, not necessarily up in your pelvis where your ureters would be. Stomach pain can be felt on the front, but it can also be felt on the back. A heart attack can be pain that radiates down your right arm. And then this one here, I use this one because I think this has happened to a lot of us. Have you ever been outside on a very cold day and maybe exercising, and you're breathing in all that cold air and you start to get a pain in your neck? That is referred pain from your lungs. Your lungs are telling your brain, gosh darn, that's cold air. And because of how your brain is wired, the region of your primary somatosensory cortex that your lungs reports to is the same region that somatosensory fibers, not visceral fibers, report to the same part of your brain. So pain refers to distal regions because of how those distal regions are connected to the primary somatosensory cortex. That is how I understand it. And it's a really interesting topic if you've ever had an injury, or as you get old, if you develop arthritis, this or that or the other thing, and you go in for physical therapy, you'll have all sorts of weird aches and pains that your physical therapist or your osteopath, not osteopath, what am I trying to say? Orthopedist, but maybe osteopath would tell you, oh yeah, that, your hamstrings are going to hurt because you've got arthritis and that just refers to your hamstrings sometime. Or, yeah, it's just really interesting. I'll shut up. 40 minutes. Thank you for making it to the end. I feel like I went on a lot of tangents today, but why should today be any different? That's the end of the class. See you in Anatomy and Physiology 2. Good luck on the last exam.